Welcome to this podcast by the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, an international non-profit research and policy organisation that tackles environment and development challenges. With 8 centres spread across 5 continents, we connect science and decision-making to develop solutions for a sustainable future for all. This special mini-series focuses on the upcoming 28th UN Climate Change Conference, COP28. The episodes are based on the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, and finance. I am your host, Katie Harris, Senior Policy Fellow at SEI. COP28 takes place at a pivotal moment in history when the world stands at a midpoint. 7 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and 7 years to 2030 when it comes to an end. This podcast critically analyses our progress so far and poses the vital question: are we on track to deliver the ambitious goals of the Paris Accord by 2030?
In this first episode, we discuss adaptation with 2 of SEI's top experts on the topic. I'm your guest host, Katherine Browne, research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute's headquarters. And I would like to introduce our guests. First, Richard Klein, senior research fellow and leader of the International Climate Risk and Adaptation Team, and Philip Osano, center director of SEI Africa. A warm welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Okay, so let's start talking about adaptation. It is often said that adaptation to climate change has attracted much less attention than mitigation, even though the Paris Agreement puts them on par. So, Richard, do you think that this is actually the case, especially over the last 7 years or even before that? And what evidence would you show to show that that is the case?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. That's absolutely the case. Prevention is better than cure. So the idea is that, and it has been for basically since the convention was negotiated back in the 1990s. The idea was that if we manage to prevent dangerous climate change, then adaptation might not actually be needed. And the idea was also that by focusing too much on adaptation, we might be distracting from the real need to reduce emissions. So there was really a push to emphasize the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and not to be distracted too much by the idea that there was also something we could do about the risks that would result from the emissions and the impacts that would be caused, because that was seen as perhaps undesirable from a political point of view. And when it comes to the evidence that you see in terms of since the Paris Agreement, where indeed they are on par, there is a goal to reduce emissions such that global temperature would be no more than 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. There's also a global goal on adaptation, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more later. But when you see how much money, for example, is spent both in the global north and in the global south on reducing emissions, and compare that to the amount of money that's made available to support adaptation activities, that's a huge difference. So I would think that mitigation is still the priority, and I think rightly so, because still prevention is better than cure. But we've been so slow in reducing the emissions that impacts have become inevitable, and that means that adaptation has become absolutely necessary as well. So it's not a choice between adaptation or mitigation. We really need to do both.
Thanks, Richard. Philip, as Richard says, prevention is better than the cure, but we're still focusing more on mitigation than adaptation. So I'm wondering what you think the implications of this imbalance are for the continent of Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And as Richard says, for the continent of Africa, if you follow through some of the positions that different countries in Africa have taken forward as part of the discussions, in the UNFCCC process, it has always been the fact that when it comes to Africa, the priority for the governments and the people are on building resilience and promoting adaptation. Two reasons inform this discussion. One is, of course, that when you look at Africa's place in terms of the historical and current emissions of greenhouse gases, it's remained very low. So in that kind of position, it means that even if Africa was to focus on mitigation, they would contribute very little in terms of changing the current situation that the world finds itself. But secondly, of course, it is clear even from the IPCC reports, including the sixth assessment report, that one, Africa is warming much faster than the rest of the world. But number two is also that the impact of climate change now is actually quite heavy in African countries, and we're seeing that increasing. So it is always then the case that African countries have prioritized adaptation. Unfortunately, of course, I think the implication of this imbalance means two things. One is that if you look at the current arrangements that we have for climate, for example, climate finance, we see a big disconnect between the financial flows that go toward mitigation and those that goes toward adaptation. I think from one of the studies that you did, it was almost like 70% of the climate finance that came to Africa between 2014 and 2018 was on mitigation. And just about 30% on adaptation. And we see that at the regional level, but also at the country level. If you look at the individual countries, we see that kind of disconnect. Number two, I think it also then brings in an issue of, I would call it part of the trust deficit that we see in the negotiations, and especially when you see African countries, because they don't feel that, the priorities for African countries are given prominence in terms of the discussions at the climate negotiations, including the conference of party meetings.
So you mentioned the climate negotiations. So I think that's a good turn to the upcoming COP28, which we know is taking place at a very important moment in history. 7 years have passed since the Paris Agreement, and we have 7 years left to 2030. And this year also marks the culmination of what's known as the first Global Stocktake. So, Richard, I'm wondering, can you explain to us what is the Global Stocktake and why is it important? And can you give us your take on what it might say on adaptation and what key messages the world might be able to take away from the Stocktake?
Sure, yes. So the Paris Agreement is the document that really underpins all global climate policy at the moment. It was agreed, as you said, 7 years ago, and it contains 3 global goals. One on temperature, in other words, mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, one on adaptation, and one on finance. It also includes a mechanism to see whether collectively all countries are doing enough to achieve those global goals. So are we actually making sufficient progress collectively, all countries together, to reduce emissions, to make sure that temperatures stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees? Are we making sufficient progress to reduce climate risk such that we're building resilience as opposed to creating new risks? And are we also meeting our finance goals? Philip already mentioned those. The verdict is out, and it's not very positive. We are perhaps, when it comes to mitigation, not doing quite as badly as a few years ago, but we're certainly not on target to 2 degrees. When it comes to finance, we're also underachieving and not meeting the goals there. And when it comes to adaptation, there it's actually a bit of a difficult decision because the global goal in adaptation is actually really quite vague. So it's very difficult to see whether countries collectively are making progress towards the global goal in adaptation, which is to enhance resilience, strengthen adaptive capacity, and reduce vulnerability. But we also know through the IPCC reports and other reports like the Adaptation Gap report that we're not very good at reducing the risks that are emerging as a result of climate change. The gap between what is needed and what we're doing is actually growing. less money is being spent than is needed. The plans that are being developed are not being implemented. So yes, there is also a need for more ambition on adaptation as well as on mitigation and finance.
Philip, Richard has mentioned that it's very difficult to know whether we're making progress on the global goal of adaptation, so at a global level. But I am wondering if you can say at the local and national level whether we're making progress and whether we're making sufficient progress. Are we seeing great strides forward? Are we seeing some entrenched challenges? And are we doing enough to help those who are hit hardest by the climate crisis?
I guess at the local level, it's a bit difficult because we don't have as much localized studies, particularly in Africa, to sort of evaluate progress being made in terms of, besides actually the actual reporting by government. And of course, the reporting by government that goes, for example, to the UNFCCC and so on, we do know that sometimes does not give a true picture of what happens. Nevertheless, having said that, I think in the context of example for Africa, where we do most of our work, is because the question about prioritizing adaptation becomes very important, not just in the context of meeting the global obligation, but also in the context of development implementation. So one of the things that has to come out very strongly, that has come out as part of the discussions toward the COP28, but also that needs to be emphasized, is that in the context of developing countries, it is not possible to isolate development and adaptation. Much of the work that happens on development contributes to adaptation, and much of what is then presented as adaptation action actually also reinforces development. So in that context, I would say that we have seen progress when it comes to local level action, because it's actually very strongly linked to development measures. And if you look at country planning, if you look at national development plans, and you look at what priorities are put in the national development plans, which are budgeted through by government domestic local budget, you see that it's really very much strongly aligned to what is articulated either in the national action adaptation plans, or even in some cases for some countries in the what they call the nationally determined contribution, which has some elements, very strong elements of adaptation.
I want to continue a little bit with this idea that the global goal on adaptation is very vague. I know that there are negotiations or discussions, I guess, ongoing about how to make it more precise. And I know that you've been involved in some of these discussions and these workshops, Richard. So can you tell us about some of these recent developments? What has been happening on these discussions since the last two COPs in Glasgow and Sharm el Sheikh?
So particularly for the developing countries, it's been very frustrating that the global goal adaptation has been so vague, because it also contributes to the lack of urgency and the lack of priority that's given to adaptation, as you said at the beginning. At the same time, the different countries have different views about what it means to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability. So to then reach agreement about how to then actually measure if you've made progress towards that particular goal is really quite tricky. There is a body under the convention called the Adaptation Committee that was tasked to come up with a solution and to find a way to make that goal more concrete, and it wasn't really able to do that. So it was given back to the countries, who then in Glasgow at COP26 decided to basically have, over a period of 2 years, 8 workshops to discuss the global goal adaptation in more detail. And that was called the Glasgow Sharm el Sheikh work program on the global goal adaptation. Then a year later, after 4 of those workshops had taken place, and it really didn't look like there was an awful lot of progress being made in terms of becoming more concrete, there was agreement among the parties in Sharm el Sheikh, so it's COP27, to initiate the development of a framework under the global goal adaptation, a framework to guide the achievement of the global goal adaptation. Back then, I remember many of us were very surprised, like, what's that framework going to do? I mean, what is it going to look like? Is it a framework to sort of restructure the negotiations the purpose of the framework wasn't really mentioned in the decision, but it has since become clear that most countries are really thinking of an indicator to define targets and indicators. And much of the discussion at the moment is about just what level of detail do these targets and indicators have to be? Are we talking about sort of high-level indicators like so many million or billion people should no longer be at risk of climate change? Or are we talking about much more specific targets and indicators for specific sectors like agriculture or public health or oceans? That's where much of the discussion is still about. It looks like there will probably be at least some agreement in Dubai on that framework, but it might not be the last word yet. I mean, in principle, the decision in Sharm el Sheikh says there should be a framework adopted in Dubai. I could imagine that the decision that adopts the framework also lays out further work for that framework to be developed. And I really hope that will be the case, because I think that framework could be more than just one of indicators and targets, but also one that creates more coherence to the way that adaptation is being discussed in the negotiations.
Thanks for that update, though it wasn't necessarily very encouraging. I actually have a follow-up question, which is something I wonder about myself. And so if you step back from the framework and the targets and the indicators, and as a long-standing scholar of adaptation, do you think it's possible to measure the effectiveness of adaptation given the tools we currently have?
We tried. We actually started a project a few years ago with British funding to see if we could trace from project reports and other materials that are being prepared by those who implement adaptation projects, to see if we, from those reports, could identify progress. We were never able to finish that project because the UK decided to cut its development funding, and our project was one of those that was sacrificed. But at the same time, we were already seeing that the materials that were available, that were prepared by donors, but also by academics, for example, often just did not contain sufficient data or sufficiently detailed data to be able to say anything meaningful about progress in terms of reducing risk and vulnerability. That is an additional problem, that if we want to say something meaningful about making progress on the global goal and adaptation, we also need to become much better at recording and reporting what it is that we're doing and what works and what doesn't work. And that's not a responsibility for the negotiators necessarily. That is really a responsibility for the individual donor agencies and the implementing agencies like the World Bank or the United Nations Development Programme or bilateral funders, and also for academics.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the tools are still not quite there, and also the information. All right, Philip, I want to turn back to you and revisit this global goal on adaptation, which we were discussing. And I know that the African group of negotiators was instrumental in getting this goal into the Paris Agreement. And so I'd like to ask if 7 years later, you think that African negotiators and African governments and countries remain optimistic about the role that the goal can play in driving ambition and action on adaptation?
From my own observation, I think there is still many African negotiators still see this goal as relevant in terms of, we talked earlier on about the imbalance between adaptation and mitigation. And I think one of the ways to look at it is that if this was taken up at the global level, it might raise the profile of adaptation and increase also ambition on adaptation, as we are seeing on mitigation. Of course, I think at the moment, the optimism is very low. And I've said, there's quite some level of deficit in terms of trust, because it's always the case that it's in that adaptation is having a lower profile compared to mitigation. And of course, it's of less concern to the decision makers, particularly in high-income countries.
I know that you also were recently involved in the development of a roadmap for African resilience that is focused on addressing and managing transboundary and cascading climate risks. I know Richard has also been involved in this work. So can you explain a little bit about these types of risks and then why the African continent is emphasizing the need to adapt to them, and also a little bit about maybe what this roadmap is calling for to address them?
Yeah, maybe Richard could outline sort of like the bigger picture about the transnational climate risk, and then I can come in around what specific issues matter to African countries.
Sure, yeah. So much of the adaptation discussion so far has assumed that climate change will happen, it will have impacts within countries, and adaptation plans and action has to address those local to national priorities, whether that is a drought or a flood or a heat wave or the need for irrigation and agriculture. What we've seen, and also what the IPCC in its latest assessment report has concluded, is that impacts and risks of climate change are actually much more complex than we initially thought, and as a result of that, also more difficult to manage and to handle. And one of that complexities is the fact that what happens in one country could easily also affect what happens in another country. The impacts and risks of climate change don't stay within the borders of one country. So the idea that national adaptation plans would address all the risks to which a country is exposed is actually overlooking the fact that some of the risks to which a country is exposed come from elsewhere. For example, from upstream rivers, but also over longer distances, for example, through the food that countries import. If a country is very dependent on food imports, then it is just as dependent on effective adaptation by the country that exports their food as it is to adaptation within its own country. Because if there are poor harvests in another part of the world where, for example, rice comes from that is imported in West Africa, for example, then that can create food insecurity within West Africa, even though the trigger for that particular drought might have been in Asia. So how do countries deal with that? How do you consider, either within your national adaptation plans or in a different kind of planning process, the fact that some of the risks that you're exposed to are actually beyond your control, are beyond your jurisdiction?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what we look at in Africa, so the roadmap that we're talking about sort of like then tries to look at in the context. So within Africa, we actually we have a climate change strategy, climate change and resilience strategy that's prepared under the guidance and leadership of the African Union. And that's supposed to inform much more collectively, not build upon all the national adaptation plans, but also look at issues that matter at the regional level. And so when we look at transboundary climate risk or transnational climate risk, we also often conceptualize this around these pathways of risk transmission. And Richard has talked about, for example, trade or people movements in terms of migration or shared transboundary resources. So the roadmap really then articulates in terms of what are the collective actions that need to be taken over and beyond the national adaptation planning that would then help build resilience when it comes to African countries within sub-regional level, but also more collectively better responding to this transnational or transboundary climate risk. And just to give you two examples, one would be even within Africa itself, when you look at shared transboundary resources, we look at, say, the river basins of Africa. And when you look at cross energy systems in Africa, some countries or most countries depend on hydroelectric power generation. And sometimes the dams that then generated electricity are not within those countries that consume, but the heavy consumer. So we see this in the Nile, we see this also in Southern Africa with Zambezi and so on. So how do we then, part of what that seek to achieve is how can these countries better cooperate to understand that adaptation measures in the source countries, for example, better respond in terms of the consuming countries? Because at the moment, we see sometimes that challenge. But also when you look at, for example, movement of people, that also reflects also in terms of movement of, say, animals, wildlife, and livestock. So in one part of the region, for example, if you look at the Horn of Africa, it's always the case that you have sometimes major drought in one part of the Horn of Africa, and so you have quite massive movements of people and livestock and wildlife to areas where they can access water and grazing land. So that then leads to many other things around, security issues, around disease transmission, but also around conflicts that then arises between, say, livestock, mobile pastoral livestock keeping communities and crop producing farmers. So this roadmap then helps to deal with those kind of issues, but it also goes beyond to then look at transboundary risks that might come from kind of more remote connections, like Richard talked about trade. So if you look at trade, we've looked at examples of trade in food services and food items, and for example, looking at rice imports in Africa from Southeast Asia. And of course, we do know that if you look at climate impacts on rice production in Southeast Asian countries like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, for example, might have serious implications around food imports to Africa, countries that depend on imports. Countries like Senegal, where rice consumption is very high, a country like Kenya, in 2019, for example, nearly 67% of the rice consumed in the country was imported from Southeast Asia. So this kind of thing then become very important to look at the national adaptation planning, to consider these levels of risk that might be transmitted from far remote places, but also then look at it collectively at the African continental level.
Yeah, you mentioned that these types of risks are going to require significant levels of collaboration across borders. And so that made me think about the recent Africa Climate Summit in September, which can you tell me about why this summit happened, why it was important, and why was adaptation high on the agenda? Did it contribute to adaptation ambition?
Yeah, so with Africa Climate Summit, just of course to put this into perspective, that the Africa Climate Summit was hosted by the government of Kenya and the African Union Commission, and this followed already two decisions that had been made at the African Union level calling for an Africa Climate Summit. So when Kenya government took over as the chair of what's called the Committee of African Heads of State on Climate Change, way back in February 2022, the new Kenyan president then took the initiative to then step up to host that summit. So this was actually something that had been long in the planning, actually, for almost, I think, 3 or 4 years before. So it's not something that was new. It was something that was already a decision of the African Union. Secondly, I think the reason it was important, I think, at this time, because the presidency of the Africa, what's called CAHOS, the Committee of African Climate Change, under the leadership of Kenya, was quite concerned about 3 things. They were quite concerned of the fact that given the scale of the climate challenge currently and the impact in Africa, that there needed to be an urgency in terms of responding, of course, to the problem. Number 2 is that there was quite a frustration around the scale of action, particularly when it came to mobilizing capital, but also mobilizing technology. And number 3, I think there was also a concern that the speed of response was inadequate and insufficient, and that needed to be changed. So, informed by those 3 things, the Africa Climate Summit itself, therefore, took a bold decision around many areas. And in terms of adaptation, obviously, as I said, the Africa Climate Summit was underpinned within the Africa Climate Change Strategy as part of the part of the key documents that inform the preparation of that summit, but also the outcome of that summit. And one of the key areas that came out of that climate summit was actually a strong call to mainstream adaptation into development planning. So earlier on, I talked about this false dichotomy between development and adaptation, and it's something that African policymakers are struggling with, because in Africa, adaptation and development are sort of two sides of the same coin. And within that call, it's very important there's an emphasis on bringing to attention the issue of debt. Obviously, at the moment, one of the challenges that African countries are facing is very high levels of debt. Nearly 31 out of 37 heavily indebted poor countries are in Africa. And that's, of course, meaning that when climate catastrophe happens, then a lot of money that was already earmarked for development activities have to be shifted towards humanitarian response. For example, if you have cyclone, as we did in Mozambique and Malawi, or if you have like major droughts like we had in the Horn of Africa for the last 3 years and so on. So that's something that they really wanted to make sure that it's at the attention of the policymakers, and was very strongly an outcome of the Nairobi Declaration on the Climate Summit.
Thank you. Okay, let's start to wrap this up. So you mentioned that the African Climate Summit was inspired by a lack of urgency, a lack of scale, and a lack of speed. And so I'm going to ask you both. We know that adaptation to date has been too slow, too small in scale, and too incremental. So what are one or two things that you think are essential to drive more transformational adaptation to help communities and ecosystems cope with climate impacts that are already occurring and are expected to intensify by 2030 and beyond 2030? So maybe we'll give Philip a break and ask Richard first.
Yeah, thanks. What I would like to see come out of COP28 is, and it's probably the process of the Global Stocktake that could inform that, is a clear recognition by all countries that adaptation, as we know it now, is insufficient. It's too fragmented. It doesn't really prioritize the biggest risks and those that are important for the poorest people. And that therefore we really need to rethink how we go about adaptation under the UNFCCC process, and also how it is funded and implemented globally. So yes, we need more ambition on adaptation, but we also need to rethink how it's then implemented. What I would like to see come out of COP28 is that recognition, and a recognition of what then needs to change in the UNFCCC process and the funding of that, of adaptation, in order to make it more coherent, more focused, and more just.
Do you have any ideas of what those things could be?
Well, one of the hopes I had when a framework was being proposed in Sharm el Sheikh under the Paris Agreement on the global goal and adaptation was that it was a framework that would not only identify targets and indicators, but also, in a way, replace the current, if you like, institutional framework under which adaptation has been governed. There is such a framework called the Cancun Adaptation Framework. It was agreed in Cancun at the climate negotiations at the time in 2010. And it was what was needed then. It was fit for purpose at the time. It, among other things, gave rise to the work program on loss and damage, which through a number of detours has now become the Fund for Loss and Damage. It was the right thing at the time, but it is simply no longer the right thing to govern and implement adaptation right now. Another part of the Cancun Adaptation Framework were the national adaptation plans. Quite a few countries have prepared those plans. Very few of them have been implemented, not only because there's no funding, but also because the funding process is incredibly complex. The prioritization is very difficult. Many of these things that give rise to a very fragmented and frankly unambitious process. That needs to change, and I think therefore also the Cancun adaptation framework needs to be replaced by another framework that isn't just looking at targets and indicators, but is rethinking how adaptation is negotiated, funded, and implemented globally under the UNFCCC process.
Okay, Philip, we turn to you. What are one or two things you think are essential to drive transformational adaptation?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think the two things. One is obviously finance, and I know we talked about finance in other discussions. Number two is technology. And when I talk about technology, I mean very practical issues. For example, one of the key gaps that we see when it comes to adaptation planning, of course, is capacity for early warning. And if you look at, for example, infrastructure that supports early warning, for most developing countries, including Africa, it is sufficiently underdeveloped. And that means, of course, that that has all sort of implication, including, of course, lack of, say, insurance for some of this sort of like catastrophe. Number two is also then it means that we then, rather than have a proactive approach to adaptation, we are forced to be very reactive to some of the issues around, for example, major flooding or major droughts. Then it turns into humanitarian issues, then which could have probably been prevented if there was better investment in early warning systems. So I just wanted to point out that when I see what is important, particularly for Africa, is actually looking at the agriculture sector. That is something that the climate impacts on agriculture production is in Africa. It's quite huge. Unfortunately, that's something that's been given very little attention compared to what it deserved. Yet when you look at many of the African countries, if you look at the economic structure, you look at the GDP and the contribution to the GDP of most countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, it's somewhere between 50 to 70%. If you look at the employment, it's about 70% on average. And yet this is something that's sort of like not sort of getting quite adequate attention that it does deserve. So that would be my two priorities: finance and technology related to early warning systems, strengthening that capacity, and of course the first line of sector to look at is the agriculture sector.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the podcast, share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To learn more about SEI and to access more resources and materials, head over to sei.org and follow us on Twitter @SEI Research. Let's connect on the next episode. Thanks for listening.